In the new book, First Films of the Holocaust, Soviet Cinema and the Genocide of the Jews, 1938 to 1946, author and historian Jeremy Hicks looks at how the Soviets exposed the real plans of Nazi Germany. Hicks sheds new light on how the world viewed Hitler and what was done to stop him. Dr. Hicks is also a senior lecturer in Russian at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob.
You know, a lot of what we've seen in terms of footage has come from American, British newsreels, or even the reels that the Nazis themselves took, but not so much Soviet reels, Soviet film. Where did you discover these films, and how did you get started on this quest to kind of look at it holistically?
Well, the thing is that these films have, they were made in 1941, 42, and so on, right up to the end of the war. I came across them when I was looking at a more general context of Soviet and Russian documentary film. My previous book was about Dziga Vertov, who's a pioneer of documentary film, and he and more particularly his wife, Elizaveta Svilova, were engaged in editing these films at the end of the war and during the war. So I really came across them, as it were, by accident. I wasn't looking for them initially, but I was working in this archive in Krasnogorsk, which is this documentary film archive just outside of Moscow, where essentially there's an extraordinary collection there. Basically, whenever they made a newsreel, they included a copy in this archive, of course, but any outtakes from that newsreel would also be included in this archive. So what they've got is this unique collection, which not only sort of gives you the proper Soviet propaganda message, if you want, but also the other material, the other images that they recorded at the time that sort of didn't back the main message of Soviet propaganda. So that's really so. Having found this material, what I then set about doing was trying to make sense of it, see how much it changed, to put it in the context of our historical understanding of the Holocaust. And so, so that's basically what I've been doing the last 6 years, having sort of chanced upon this material. I've been trying to really make sense of it, and the book that came out, well, I got my copy certainly earlier on this week. That's really the product of this research.
And can you tell us about instances where you saw the outtakes or the things that weren't used during the actual newsreel really differ from what was said that was actually shown to the Soviet public? Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, and the listeners will be aware, that the war the incredible, almost incomprehensible loss of life on the Eastern Front as the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. This really meant that the emphasis upon, you could say, the emphasis tended to be upon the loss of life more generally, not simply, as we tend to sort of stress in the West, the Holocaust, the loss of the Nazis' particular targeting of the Jews, which of course that happened also in the occupied Soviet territories, as I'm sure you're aware. As many as 2 million Soviet Jews lost their lives. But the propaganda message tended to not stress that. The Soviet official propaganda tended to stress really the released newsreels, let's say. It tended to stress the peaceful Soviet citizens, the loss of Soviet lives, the threat against the Soviet state, the Soviet population, really, in general. So the newsreels, released newsreels don't tend to show that the victims were Jewish. They don't tend to name the victims very often, as in such a way as might enable viewers, spectators, to understand that the Jews were, the first victims, as it were. But when you look at, say, for example, I found a whole number of images from a place called Barvyenkovo, which is in the Kharkov oblast of East Ukraine. There you can find, in the released newsreels, you find a whole lot of people lying in the snow, dead, killed by the Nazis. In the outtakes, you find that they were wearing Star of David armbands. So it's very evident, the image from that image, that they were Jewish. And you can find a number of images like this, not an enormous number. Some of them, that was completely my discovery. There's another image, for example, from the Soviet cameraman took of the Auschwitz concentration camp, which it has been released before. In the 80s, there was a German film made of it, but it's kind of been forgotten, as it were, and I sort of, as it were, rediscovered it. And that shows the Jewish ritual prayer shawls. Obviously, we're very familiar with the piles of shoes of the victims, or glasses and prosthetic limbs and so forth. But the piles of teleskotten of ritual prayer shawls make it clear that the extent of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust.
And why was this? Was it simply because they thought the message was going to be more powerful, or because there was a lot of anti-Semitism also in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, no, I obviously, you can stress the first part of that, and that I could come back to that. But the second part, the sense of the sense that there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union is important. I mean, of course, it's a complex thing in that in the the 1920s, the Jewish people had more opportunities in the Soviet state than they'd had probably certainly in the Tsarist state prior to that. There weren't sort of the quotas and the official discrimination. But there was a rising tide. Certainly, there was a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. This became, I mean, it's important to remember that the sort of dominant anti-Semitism that sort of coloured post-war life really from 1946 onwards, but after the formation of the State of Israel, this really sort of, that became really enormous, as I say, in post-war life. But during the war, it was a kind of an increasing but fairly marginal tendency, but it was increasing, and so you saw these. There was an example would be the tendency of a number of prominent Jewish cultural figures felt the need to change their names during the war. So in film, Roman Katzman had to change his name to Roman Grigoriev, and you can find those sort of curious things. So there is this fear of on the part of Jews of anti-Semitism, and it's a real fear. It is a rising tide. I think basically one could explain. There are lots of ways to explain this. I know some people have argued that Stalin himself was an anti-Semite. We know, for example, when he found his daughter had a relationship with Alexei Kapler, he said to her that why couldn't you find yourself a Russian? So apparently, so he certainly did say some anti-Semitic things and appears to have held anti-Semitic views. But I think it's more to do rather than with his own personality, with a kind of an increasing nationalism, increasing way in which the Soviet state becomes about a national and ethnically defined project, and less about internationalism and sort of, as it were, equal rights for all ethnicities.
And thinking about these films, how do they differ from the American reels? Would you see Americans trying to emphasize the suffering of the Jews more? Would you see them trying to demonize Nazism more? Or how do they contrast?
Yeah, well, with regard to the representation of Jews, in fact, they differ less than you might think, in that there is a little bit more mention of the Jews in U.S. footage. Similarly, one could talk about the British obviously made footage in Bergen-Belsen which they liberated, but the American footage of Dachau, of Buchenwald, does talk about the Jews a bit more, but not an enormous amount. Curiously, that sort of present day sense of the Holocaust is much more something that's emerged since the 1960s. It's commonly thought, at least. What's really different about the Soviet footage is that the victims died in a different way to the concentration camps. So most of these people were shot and buried in pits. So the most famous of those, of course, is the ravine outside Kiev, Babi Yar, where more than 30,000 Jews were killed, and probably as many as 100,000 victims in total. This and other places. The thing is that's not the only one. There are places like that outside all of the occupied towns and cities and even villages of Ukraine, Belarus, southern Russia, the North Caucasus, and so forth. So what we see in these Soviet images tends to be, I'm afraid, the sort of excavations rather than them talking to survivors. Though there is some footage like that. There's very interesting footage of a trial in Kiev where someone, Dina Pranicheva, who survived the Babi Yar massacre, tells exactly what happened to her in a courtroom, and you can find some sort of testimony like this recorded on film. But I'm afraid, for the most part, what you see is the excavation of bodies, and we see the relatives recognizing their loved ones. We see grieving figures, and these grieving figures of the bereaved, those discovering their murdered dear members of their family. These images really are what stands out to me in terms of what's different about the Soviet footage as opposed to the Western footage. The Western footage, the survivors of these camps, they're not very individualized. They don't have any direct connection, for the most part, to the soldiers who are liberating these places. And by contrast, what the Russian or the Soviet footage does is sort of show us the distress of someone connected to the dead. So we have a sort of sense that this matters to that person, and it really should matter to us too. So I'd say that would be the main distinction I draw.
A lot has been written about Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for the Nazis. Was there a Soviet counterpart, and what was that person's job as it relates to what Goebbels' job was?
That's interesting. Yes. Well, I mean, there was. We can talk about a number of these figures that ran the. I think it's the part of the Communist Party Central Committee that was in charge of propaganda and agitation. Alexander Shcherbakov and Grigory Alexandrov, but that neither of them really had the weight and the importance that you could attribute to Goebbels, who's a kind of, in his own infernal, diabolic way, as a sort of original and independent thinker, as it were, sort of one of the architects of the Nazi project. None of these almost on a level with Hitler himself. So there's nobody who's on a level in the Soviet context with Stalin. So I mean, I think that in terms of Soviet cinema, there are one or two interesting figures, however, who stand out and are particularly interesting. I would say one of the most interesting figures of Soviet cinema during the war, in terms of newsreel cinema at least, would be Roman Carmen. He's somebody who had been in Soviet newsreel and Soviet journalism since the 1930s. He'd been sent to Spain and to other sort of. I think he went to Khalkhin Gol in the battle in Mongolia with the Japanese, and he was sent to various different parts of the front to photograph things, and then ends up having sort of photographed a whole number of these different atrocities. I mean, in the Battle of Moscow and at various different places, he ends up at the Nuremberg Tribunal making a Soviet film about the Nazi crimes there.
What's something people interested in this time period, interested in Soviet history and the history of World War II, could take away from this book?
I'd say there would be two main things I'd like people to consider, and those were the sense in which there's this awful event, this act of mind-blowing violence, that trying to make sense of it for film, to sort of create a narrative about it, was a very difficult process. And the Soviets really started to do this before anyone else. And so they found a way to shape this, to say something about it. And, you know, they created this message whereby we show the atrocities, and then the Red Army and others are meant to avenge these atrocities. So that would be the key thing that people can see. I think the second thing is maybe they can extrapolate from that and see that, you know, on the one hand, you've got this incredible act of violence, the Holocaust, and you can, and if they look at the Russian example, they can see how this can be sort of formed into a sort of a narrative, a message by anyone. And so I think that by studying that sort of how it's formed, how it's how a story is told about it on the Russian side, they can sort of see how other narratives, how, you know, you can Americanize the Holocaust, or you can say something about the Holocaust for that suits a kind of British perspective or an Israeli perspective. All of these messages can be taken out of it, but the sheer fact of it is, in some sense, something that defies all understanding and all attempts to make sense of it.
That's Dr. Jeremy Hicks. He's a senior lecturer in Russian at Queen Mary University of London. His new book is titled First Films of the Holocaust, Soviet Cinema and the Genocide of the Jews, 1938 to 1946. Dr. Hicks, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Rob.